All right, so thank you for having me and presenting. I'm pretty sure most of you online know who I am. Most people sort of know who I am. We really haven't gotten to know each other, but I'm sure we will. So my name is Antonio and I am the Community and Consumer Engagement Manager at the Spinal Research Institute. And our offices are based at the Royal Talbot. And before I start, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So what we do at the Spinal Research Institute is that we seek to build research collaboration and consumer engagement to improve the lives of people with SCI. So basically what we see is that research is a group effort. So people working around the world, so that's researchers, clinicians, and people with lived experience all working together to improve the quality of life. And I'll discuss later about the different types of ways that research can improve quality of life. So that's what we do there. So today, basically, I want to talk about what is research. So research is something that a lot of people with spinal cord injuries talk about, but then how do we, how does it actually work? The impact of spinal cord injury research. So how has it had an impact on the quality of life as well as the potential, and then how to get involved as well. So what is research? So this is a question that I get asked a fair bit, or something that especially during COVID, like research was a hot topic during then. It's like, okay, well, what is research? Yeah, we like to think we know what it is. And when I explain it, you probably think, okay, and we actually do forms of research in our everyday life. Why not do academic scientific research, but we do forms of research. So research is a systemic investigation to increase knowledge. So put simply, it's a process that you go through to increase the knowledge that you or an organization have. Technically, research involves identifying our hypothesis. So what is it that we want to answer, collecting and analyzing data, disseminating the findings. I like to put it basically as research is just simply creating new knowledge. So if we find out something that we didn't know before, we can say, okay, well, we can find out why something happens. It can also reinforce something. So we may see something happening and we can develop a better understanding of why it happens as well. But it's essentially new knowledge. The power of research, and this is sort of where, I sort of really am interested in, is that research has the ability to positively impact the quality of life of people with spinal cord injuries by addressing the challenges that we face. So we're all unique with our spinal injuries. Some people have pain, some people have spasticity, bladder bowel issues. So although we have common issues, there are individuals that are unique to us. What I see the power of research is taking those challenges and turning them to questions, and then asking those questions to people that can potentially get the answers. So that's the power that I see research has. So, it's really being proactive and sharing experience on, how we can address the challenges. Research in everyday life. So obviously technology, a lot of technology that we use every day is a result of research, people coming up with ideas, what have you. The big discussion around the technological world at the moment is AI. So there's a lot of research going into the dangers of AI, or the benefits as well. There's medical research. So a lot of what we speak about in the spinal world is medical research. That does overlap. Technology and medicine do overlap. There are fields that never existed before. So biomedical engineering, things like that, 3D printing in this space as well. So technology then has that influence on medical research. There is then disability research. So there are now dedicated streams of research dedicated to disability. 40 years ago, universities weren't teaching things called disability studies, where now they are. And that impacts people with spinal cord injuries or disabilities, but spinal injuries as well. And then there's, I guess, the area that I'm in is that how does research impact everyday quality of life and the social and psychological side? How do people interact? Why do people get along? Or why do some people don't get along? Things like depression, anxiety, and all that. That's fine. So some examples of research. So we have what's called exploratory research, or some people call this basic research. So in a spinal example, so what causes spinal cord injuries and secondary complications? So what's the actual mechanism? Why do some people get pain? Why do some people don't? Why do some people have bladder issues and why don't? Why are spinal cord injuries so unique? What is it about them? How does it affect us? Then there's clinical research. So how do we treat SCI injuries and secondary complications? So we're trying to explore what causes it. Then how do we treat it? Social research. What is the social impact of having an SCI? And a lot of you being peer support workers and peer support mentors, you sort of fall into this. So there have been countless studies done into the benefit of peer support through social research and its benefits on other areas. And, so it's not a medical intervention, but, there has been research to show benefits of peer support. And then psychological research. So what's the mental side, the individual mental side of living with the SCI? So, the impact of trauma, the impact of actually acquiring a disability, living with a disability, short-term, long-term. There are other types of research, we can sort of go on with that, but sort of the main areas that we'll discuss is sort of here. So once again, we talk about how research works. It starts with a question. So everything with research sort of starts with a question, but how do we come up with that question? And as I said before, the context is that we take our challenges. So what is it that we deal with as people, as individuals and groups of people in spinal cord injuries, and how do we address that? So it's taking our challenges, turn to a question, creating a technique to answer the question. So that's commonly called a method. Gathering information to answer the question, looking and analyzing the information collected, and then sharing the information. Wherever this is example, they always put it in a cycle, because it's that ongoing thing of repetition. So at the end of something, you raise new questions. And that's something that can happen. So how do we apply this in everyday life? So do scientists do this? So not really. So I wanted a new washing machine. Yep. So the question was, what kind of washing machine do I want? And you all may do this. So identify the question, design the study. So where am I going to get information to find a new washing machine? I then conduct the study. So I went through Google, what have you. I analyze the information. So there are people out there that are impulse buyers. I am not one of them. I need to know exactly what I'm doing. And then I share that information. So I've made a decision based on the information and I'm sharing it. If Josh asks me, oh, you bought that new washing machine, so I'm then going to share that word of mouth. We do this every day. It's a process that we do every day. So it's not necessarily limited, and I know I'm simplifying it, but it's not a process that's limited to the world of academia. We are doing this constantly in what we do every day. It's the way our sort of brains work to evolve. The SCI Research Challenge is, and part of that is, SCIs are incredibly complex. So we talk about why does it, what are the challenges that spinal cord researchers traditionally face, is that they're incredibly complex. No two are the same, firstly. So as individuals, we may all have lived experience of spinal cord injury, but once again, our complications are different, our lesions are different, everything is different. The way our lesions affect us are different. Josh and I technically have the same level of injury, but functionally we're different. Spinal injuries remain incredibly rare compared to other illnesses and injuries. So if we look at cancer, we look at diabetes, the volumes they have are really large compared to people with spinal cord injuries. Spinal cord injuries are still less than 0.5% of the Australian population. So although it impacts us and it does impact people around us, from a purely numbers point of view, and unfortunately, a lot of times decisions and policies is made by numbers, as a population, it's still less than 0.5% of the population. Progress takes time to implement, and you look at medical research and what have you, in some cases, from asking a question to implementation in medical research, it can take up to 17 years. You know, and that's because, and we'll go through the process of, okay, well, we want to make sure something's safe. Is what we're doing better than the current treatment? You know, and I know Mario in our discussion can probably talk a lot better than this than I can. But yeah, that's one of the challenges. But to me, this is all really exciting. That's why I do what I do, because it is a challenge. There are ways that we can address this. An example I use, and you asked a question before about if we can join things. So I'm simplifying it, but I've shared this with people in the know, and they're now using this as well. So if you imagine, so there's the vertebrae, which is bone, but the actual spinal cord is the density of toothpaste. You know, so it's really, really malleable, I guess, and fragile. So as an exercise, if you get a tube of toothpaste and draw a line on the table, if you squeeze it, try and get it back in the exact same spot, with every particle being in the exact same spot. So if you severed your spinal cord injury like me, run your finger through the toothpaste and try and get everything back to the exact same spot. So that's part of the enormity of the challenge of what they're trying to do. The way they address that challenge, and something that they've changed the way, and I will touch on this more, and I have touched on it a bit already. So they address this challenge through what's called the biopsychosocial approach. So it breaks down everything to 3 areas. So your biological research, so things like curative medicine, what have you, so fixing the issue with the toothpaste. Psychological research, that mental side, so how do we mentally deal with what's happened? And then social research, so we spoke about peer support. So that then asks questions like, you know, why is it that people with spinal cord injuries are less likely to work after injury? Why do less of them go back to study? You know, what are the social parameters? And nowadays, if you look at a lot of the research that happens, they sort of feel they overlap, but a lot of them will identify, and they'll be specialists in various fields. And that then, to me, and the way I sort of put it is, SCI research is this big puzzle. Every bit of research we do, whether it comes up with a positive, and I don't like the word negative finding, it's a finding. So like I said before, sometimes research can show that, well, something that we thought may help actually doesn't. That fits into an overall puzzle. So if you look at the undone side, that's all the questions that haven't been asked yet. And obviously the puzzle that's put together are the questions that have been done. They all fit in together. Any questions so far? Because I will have a lot of time at the end for discussion. And I really want to get through these slides quick so we can have those discussions, but I'm happy to take questions at this stage.
I found it more interesting, though, your breakdown of research, because I think, you know, we all have our own perception. And when I hear research, I guess I automatically thought stem cell, you know, because obviously that's going to benefit us or potentially myself if it was to work. But yeah, that was an interesting breakdown.
Oh, am I sharing this? I think I am.
Ask me.
I think I am. Sorry, we've made a mistake. Well, I
couldn't see yeah, I couldn't see the slides, and
why didn't anyone tell me?
you muted them all.
I didn't even get a text.
I thought you were talking from the top of your head.
Yeah, that would be really impressive if I did.
Yeah.
It was good anyway. That's it. Lucky you had a break. We go finish with the main course. Did you want water while we have the interim nurse? Antonio?
Sorry about that. But yes, I could do it all off the top of my head if needed, but no need to. All right, apologies. I blame myself. I take full responsibility, and there's water everywhere. All right, so moving forward. So the SCI puzzle. So what are the areas? And I guess to Josh's point, so things like stem cells, spasms, neuroregeneration, hand function, medication, acute care. And Mario can talk about that. You know, there's the social side, the psychological side, employment, peer support, pain management. Rehabilitation is a really big one. So, yeah, and behind each of these tiles, imagine another 20 or 30 tiles. So they're just things that sort of keep adding to the puzzle. Let's talk about, so moving on. So let's talk about the history of SCI research. SCI research is not a new thing. There is evidence that the Egyptians were fascinated by this phenomenon that was paralyzing people. We then fast forward, and we can spend hours and hours just going through the history of SCI research. So in 1890, the first experimental models were done on rabbits. So it's not something that is new. There was that lab in Germany that started. If we fast forward to one of the most significant people in SCI research is Sir Ludwig Guttmann. In 1944, he became the head of spinal injuries at Stoke Mandeville Hospital. So that hospital is still there today. The modern foundations of rehabilitation were formed with an increase in life expectancy and quality of life. So we all went through, maybe not yourself, Gary, but most of us went through Talbot or a form of rehab. And a lot of those foundations were built on the work that Guttmann did. So the thing was, okay, well, we have these people living with this condition. How do we then, so this is sort of, I guess, part of movement from purely medical to then, all right, well, how are people going to live with this? So the treatment wasn't let's cure them, the treatment was let's manage it. And a lot of that, a lot of what we do today, including here at AQA, started here. He's also the father of the Paralympic Games. So the Paralympic Games were first called Stoke Mandeville Games. That was part of his rehab experience, that, getting people physically active. Another significant study was this one in Canada. Not a neuroscientist. I've read the study, but I'm not a neuroscientist. I'll preface that. So, research went really quiet, and then these people in a lab in Canada found that neurons, axons from neurons. So if you look at the picture there, axons is basically the bridge connecting the two circles, that these could be regenerated within the peripheral nervous system. So basically it's like, okay, there's hope here that things can be regenerated. So this study then led to a lot of the studies that happen today. If this study didn't happen, a lot of the work today wouldn't necessarily happen. Spoke a bit before about the social side. So this was championed by a group in the UK. And basically they said, okay, we are not disabled by our physical functions. We are disabled because society doesn't cater for us. So there's, a lot of build-ins and things like today are a result of this. And a lot of the, like I said, the field of disability studies stems from this. So how can we make the world easier for people to live with a disability? So once again, it fits into that biopsychosocial. It's like, all right, we accept the medical condition, we're working on fixing that, but how can we fix the fact that the people with spinal cord injuries live with this? So I'm often asked, okay, well, what's the impact, or how can we visualize the impact? And sort of the biggest things are improved critical and acute care. So what happens at the time of your spinal injury, from the moment that you have your spinal injury until you end up in hospital and they've assessed you and what have you, what's happening, the processes that paramedics take, doctors, ED doctors, and I know Mario can speak more on this later. A greater understanding of the injury and its complications. So over time, things like medical imaging have really helped, to develop an understanding of what is it about people that acquire spinal injuries that affects their bladder, their bowel, other areas. Why do some people get pain? Why do some people don't? Why the different types of pain, as well as preventative measures. We've spoken a little bit about improved rehabilitation techniques, things like wheelchair setups and what have you. And then improved equipment. When we think about spinal research, we don't necessarily think about equipment, but the advances in wheelchairs, the advances in especially electric wheelchairs and what have you, that ability, and the amount of money that goes into that adaptive equipment, and even things like companies like Independence Australia, who work with, who supply things like catheters and all that. There's research that goes into certain catheters, so you can buy catheters, for example, that have a silver coating, that help, are meant to help with infection. So they've done research on that. So that's sort of the impact. But how do we visualize that? So an increased life expectancy post spinal cord injury. The reality was, right up until the end of World War II, so Harvey Cushing, who Cushing's disease is named after, so he was famously quoted in that the conditions were such that 80% died in the first week, and only cases survived in which the spinal lesion was a partial one. The reality was that for many of us, if we were born centuries ago, we would have died at the scene of our injury. And I know that's a really harsh thing to say, but it's part of the reality. And physicians, that was the reality. In the last 3 decades, there's been a 40% decline in the mortality rates during the first 2 years, and I'll speak about that as well. So part of that is obviously better techniques of, okay, how do we, we don't just throw people in the back of an ambulance and what have you. There are procedures now, and I guess the big thing we see that, the best visual way of seeing that is in sport. When somebody hits their head or lands on their back or something, the protocols, we might think as sports fans, this is taking a while, but the protocols that happen now are a result of, we understand that at the time of injury, that has longer effects. So if someone's quality of life 20 years from now is affected by what we do today, which is really important. Like I said, Mario can probably talk a lot about that more than I can with his level of expertise. Once again, spoke about Gutman, but it's hard to not speak about Gutman when it comes to spinal cord injury, so way of injury management, survival rates. So part of what he was doing, because people were living longer. So because people were living longer, they then needed to have quality of life. So when people weren't surviving spinal injuries, the term rehabilitation for spinal injuries didn't exist, because there would be fatalities, let's say. So part of what the work he did came out of the need that, well, we've got all these people now surviving. How do they then start to live with the injury? And a big part of that, and I'll discuss, is managing secondary complications. Part of that is the neurogenic bladder. So as I said before, people, their life expectancy was basically 2 weeks or 2 years. So the reality was, if you survived your injury, you would die of things like kidney failure and infection. So nowadays you get a bladder infection or a kidney infection, you go to your doctor, get some antibiotics, and they're able to treat that, especially complex ones as well, that we get. The ability to empty your bladder. We all have bladder management systems. So the ability to do that is a fairly new thing in modern, and like I said, Mario can talk about it, it's a fairly new thing in modern science. So one of the biggest killers for people with spinal cord injuries was bladder and kidney complications. You would die of kidney failure, essentially. Spasticity. So the development of oral medications to alleviate spasticity. Now, I'm not saying with any of these that the current treatments are perfect. We all have spasms, we all have bladder issues, we all have bowel issues, we all have pain issues, yeah? What I'm saying is that the treatments we now have are better than what they used to have because they've looked into it. I'm not saying that what we have now is perfect. I'm saying that this is the reality within the field. So baclofen, we all take baclofen. So, baclofen started off as an epileptic medication. They found that it did nothing for epilepsy, but they gave it to people with spinal cord injury and so it calms their spasms. So sometimes, I'm trivializing that, but that's essentially what happens. Sometimes they find looking to researching one thing, but then they apply it elsewhere. But imagine, once again, for those that take it, imagine life without baclofen, and how bad spasms could be. Pain management. So previously untreatable neuropathic pain can be addressed with certain anticonvulsants and antidepressant medications. Once again, that was a bit of trial and error. So they took medications that they knew would help with one thing that help with other. Once again, I'm not saying that the treatments are perfect, but imagine life if we didn't have some of the medications that we have now. So And the big thing is redefining recovery. We've spoken a bit about this as well. The focus began shifting around ensuring that quality of life for people with spinal cord injuries was improved, rehabilitation techniques on utilising existing function and living with paralysis. So that a lot of research goes into that. So how do we get involved? So the traditional way for consumers to get involved is as a research participant. Consumers influence research by providing data to studies. Okay, so where does that fit in? So we have the research cycle, so that fits in here. Okay, so they've identified the question, they've designed the study. Basically, we're saying, all right, we want you involved. How does this look? So we all know clinical trials, so we think about research, we think of clinical trials, we think of labs, what have you, focus groups, surveys, as well as interviews. Clinical trials provide research with an opportunity to trial their research into a new clinical treatment. So they seek to see if the new treatment works. Is it better than existing treatments? Because if something's out there already and the new intervention isn't any better, why would we do it? Why spend money in researchers? And the side effects. And obviously that goes through a process of, okay, well, what are the side effects? And sometimes, for example, I take Ditropan. One of the side effects is a dry mouth, but even though I know that, I still take it because of the positive things, so, and we all may do that in our own life. How to get involved? I will send these links to Josh and Josh will send them out. So don't worry if you can't get them now. So the Australian government has a clinical trials website. And then there are 2 specific global SCI trial finders, so they're dedicated to people with spinal cord injuries. But like I said, I will send that to Josh and Josh will get that out to you. So focus groups is another really interesting area. So once again, it's not necessarily a clinical thing, it fits into other areas. So they provide an opportunity, hello Duke, to collect data in the form of personal and lived experience, so in perspective. So this is traditionally what's known as a qualitative study. These studies provide an opportunity to share a story. So, you'll be interviewed, right? Josh, tell me your perspective of going to the Paralympics. And I might ask 15 Paralympians, and they all may give me different answers. And I collect that and then do a study on that. Opportunity to share a story. So what is your story living with spinal cord injury? Okay, and you find a lot of this in social and psychological research. Surveys. So surveys can detect trends in large populations. So we can send out a survey and say, okay, well, what's happening? This is what's called a quantitative data. So we're looking at the numbers of the purely volume. And in this case, we're looking for what story do the numbers tell? So like, what is it that, people can do? The best example of this was a survey done in America by a professor called Kimberly Anderson. She actually has lived experience of spinal cord injury herself. So she conducted a nationwide survey, and there have been others since, of priorities of spinal cord injury population. So the impact of this is that basically she asked people with spinal cord injuries, what areas of your life, we spoke about before about taking challenges, she asked people, what are your challenges? This survey then influenced policymakers to where they fund research. So it's like, well, it wasn't what the researchers thought was an issue. So we actually asked people what the issue was. And sometimes you may get a survey of people. You may see some on the SRI social media and SRI website. It's like, well, it's a survey. How can it help me? Sometimes the larger clinical trials, and this does happen, need the surveys before they can do them. So they actually need to justify. So we all want to be part of the large trials, but a lot of those trials will have surveys or interviews in the lead up so they can get funding, essentially. So we need to be engaged. So consumers need to be engaged in research. So we need to keep up to date. This is one of the biggest challenges for people. Where do we get information? This ensures that we make informed choices. So it's like, so if we go to a physio, for example, are we asking our physio, well, is what you're doing backed by research? Can you show me the research? You're then forcing them to make sure that what they're doing is up to date. So we can ask them, even if we don't have access themselves. Where to look? Google Scholar. Government websites, so most government websites are things like the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, what have you, state governments, so healthdirect.gov.vic, etc. So they can't put work out. So you'll find that the government funds a lot of research, which means they disseminate a lot of research. CAC is the same. So they're funding research, a lot of stuff that they put out there, they need to get it out there. Scientific meetings, and journals and publications, scientific meetings, conferences, research-backed organisations. So AQA, for example, may put out a publication where they paid a researcher to do something. Things, I guess, not to look at. My mate on Facebook. We saw a lot of that during COVID. My mate told me, that's not always reliable. But there are some places as well. One of the big places to look at, once again, I'll send these links to Josh. There's a Canadian organisation called SCI Project, so Spinal Cord Injury Resource Evidence. And basically what it is this company does the groundwork for you. You go to their website, so you click on where it says evidence modules, you go down, and anything you can think of, bladder, bowel, pain, it will give you the up-to-date research. So they have two forms. So they have SCI Professional, SCI Community. But if you go on there, they've done the groundwork for you. They've gone through the journal articles, so you don't have to. Okay, and I'll send that link to Josh. Another one is elearnsci.org. So this is one that got re-released last year. So this is an innovation of the International Spinal Cord Society. This is, once again, these are both free, so you can go in and use them. So this provides evidence about treatment and living with the spinal cord injury. So it's all research-based. Yep, so once again, they've done the work for you. Okay, so they're really good resources on where to get information. So I spoke before, we need to drive research outcomes. So how can we do that? So this is where traditionally we've been involved. In research, my goal and what I want to do is I really want people with spinal cord injuries being involved in these two areas. So we're helping identify the problem, and whether that's taking part in surveys, sitting on environs, advisory networks, or designing. We really need to be the ones working in partnership with researchers to really change the narrative. So I get asked about my job, I get asked about different areas, and one of the common areas are stem cells. So the theory, stem cells are cells that can self-renew indefinitely into different types of functioning cells. Once again, I'm simplifying this. Mario, sorry if you listen. The idea is to prevent future damage, bridge lesions, and promote regrowth of nerves. So that's what they think it can do. The current reality. Yeah. Okay. So the current reality is that many ongoing studies are looking at the use of stem cells, and what they have what's called inconsistent findings. So basically they're doing the similar studies, getting different results back. But it's not to say it won't help, that's the terminology that they have.
Different how do you mean, like as in placebo or like nothing, something?
Okay, so they're running it against placebos, let's say, but they're doing similar trials. So they're asking the same question, but they're getting different answers back every time they ask the question. So that's sort of what they're saying. So there's no uniformed answer. So for something to become practice, let's say, the example I use is if you take Panadol, and we'll talk about this when I talk about cannabis. If you buy paracetamol, the drug in Australia, if you buy it overseas, you buy it anywhere, you'll have the same result from the same dose. Okay, because that's consistent. What they're saying is that with these sort of studies, they're actually not consistent. Okay, it's not to say that they won't work in the future. It's not to say that 100 years from now that this is the best treatment. Saying at this moment in time, this is the reality. Once again, there is no stem cell therapies approved for SCI, many unapproved. And, we all know the ones that you can go to wherever and they'll inject stem cells in you and you come back and walk. So they are unapproved. And they offer, there is research going into this, cell transplantation-based therapies. So basically what it's saying is I've got You know, you tell me where your level is, I'm going to inject some stem cells in there and you'll work. It's not how it works in reality. That's stem cells. Cannabis is another one I get asked about. The use of medical grade cannabis and derivatives such as oil may help with secondary complications such as spasticity and neuropathic pain. That's the theory. So the evidence is that early evidence is that medical cannabis may assist with neuropathic pain, but inconsistent evidence on reducing findings. Okay, so that's the current state of play. Much of the evidence is anecdotal, so it's hearsay. You know, it's basically saying, well, I smoke this and I feel better the next day, sort of thing. A lot of the evidence is that. With this one in particular, seek out medical advice before using cannabis, because there are risks associated with cannabis. You know, there are things that it can do to your brain and psychology. Yeah. Wasn't biting today.
Is the battery dying?
What's that? Okay. So functional electrical stimulation, or called FES. So you may have seen a FES bike, you may have had some electrodes attached to you. So the theory is that stimulating muscles that are weak or paralyzed may increase functional capacity, may be used in secondary complications such as bladder, bowel management, strength, bone density, spasticity, and orthostatic hypertension, so high blood pressure. So the evidence is that electrical stimulation in the form of FES cycling can maintain or improve strength. So is that there is a strength element. Weak evidence to show improvements in cardiovascular improvement or walking. So there is some evidence, but they're going to do more. And they're looking into areas such as bladder and bowel management using electrical stimulation. You know, so how does that work, as well as respiratory function? So epidural stimulation. So this is a really big one at the moment. So the use of epidural devices to address complications through SCI, through stimulation. So essentially what they're doing is they're putting a device, so epidural, so there are 3 layers of your spinal cord. So the top level is called your dura. So basically what they're saying is they're putting something on top of the dura and they're stimulating. The theory is that, you know, and this is one of the really big areas where there is a lot of unknown. So they're looking to improve pretty much everything associated with spinal injury. You know, respiratory function, strength, sexual function, pain management, core strength, thermoregulation, cardiovascular function. The reality is, Josh, I've done you.
Did you get battery now?
It's probably because I spilled water all over it. Continuing research on the applications of epidurals are ongoing in this area, with evidence showing some benefits. Once again, the challenges of this is much of the evidence at the moment remains weak. Devices are individual. So the challenge in this area, it isn't that just we create one device and it works on everyone. Because we have different lesions, different types of function, devices basically need to be custom made for us, and they target certain things. So it's not one device will fix everything. It's like, what are we trying to fix in the body and who are we trying to fix it in? So it's not to say that there isn't evidence that this will work, because it's weak evidence, but you know, there's a lot of potential in this area. The big thing, I guess, with all this as we come to the end is managing frustration. So progress is happening at a global level. It just takes time. So it's not that things aren't happening. It just takes time. Avoid buying into the media hype around curative medicine. So if you're looking into that, then you're going to be frustrated. Focus on the other areas of research because there are advancements in that area, you know, that don't necessarily get the media attention, and keep up to date where possible. On that note, let's have a discussion. I don't have to click next anymore. All right.
You said there was some other that don't get attention with the research, so that epidural.
Yep.
So I've seen that being done or heard about at the rehab. They're doing the arm one.
Yep.
What sort of other ones are there? Is like above lesion, below lesion?
Once again, they're all really unique, depends where it's funding. So that one there is by a researcher called Mary Galea. So she's currently running those. There's another one that called Synctron that are currently looking at using stimulation devices that they used in motor neurone disease. There are a lot in that space, so every country will have its own, and in different areas. There are organisations that are looking to use that in bladder and bowel function. You know, how can we help use epidural stimulation in bladder and bowel function? So to highlight one study is difficult, but there are labs around the world, including Australia, that are looking at that. So that don't necessarily get the attention as well.
They're looking for participants in that EES at the time, but recently, are they?
Yep, they still are.
It didn't fit me.
No, and that's the thing. You sort of have to fit within the criteria as well.
Do you mind sharing that? What part didn't?
I've had the nerve and tendon fracture.
That's right.
So yeah.
I
don't know what happens when if you actually join your spinal cord back together.
Yeah.
Your hands are gonna be-
Yeah.
Is there an element where you're allowed? I guess it's.
Well, it comes.
It's like, can you do it even just to see from a benefit point of view? But if it's not proven, then to your point.
I guess an example of that is obviously I'm limited by hand function. When I first had my injury, they offered me tendon transfers. I said no to. Years later, they were doing nerve transfers, but you had to do it within the first 6 months, where now they'll do nerve transfers pretty much at any time.
Yeah.
So I guess that's an evolution of, okay, just in hand function, the way they've addressed things. So it was really limited when I had rehab compared to if I had my injury now, the process that I would have. That's 20 years.
It's taken a long time. I had my 5-year review a few weeks ago on my hand surgery. I was the 52nd one to have it done. And just a couple of weeks, or probably a month ago now, they've done the 100th one. And that's been in the last few years.
And this goes to the point that I said about spinal cord injuries are really rare.
Yeah.
So to have the right, to do the research, you need the right person with the right type of injury. And because there aren't many of us, as you say, it's really slow. So you were 59, it's only just over going on 100. So that's the thing. There aren't many of us out there for them to do the type of studies that they want on sometimes.
Yeah.
So.
I think Naz asked you a question too.
Yes, Naz?
How you wrote it.
Oh, that's right.
I'm off my phone.
Okay.
Just mute me.
I see it. Project Spark, can you tell?
I think that's that one at the top.
That's that one at the Talbot that Mary Galea's doing. So that's to the point they're looking to restore hand function using nerve stimulation. So that's an ongoing study. Yeah. So what they're looking at, so they're looking at people that haven't had, don't know the exact terminology. I know I'm aware of it. They're looking at people that haven't necessarily had interventions on their hands or hand function. They're looking at the use of, it's a different one. Well, if you know about it, Naz, how about you tell me about it?
Should we ask Dr. Mario as well?
Is Naz on the line? Is he on?
Yeah, he's the AQA one down the bottom here.
What's your takes on the presentation, Dr. Cruz?
Yeah, Dr. Cruz.
Well, firstly, that's very good and very comprehensive. Got through a lot, you know.
I was going to say, as an SRI board member, how did I go?
Oh, I think it's very informative, and not just an SRI board member, but I learned some stuff as well. Like some of that medical history is quite interesting, and I didn't know that myself. So I'm sure everyone learned a bit. Thanks a lot. And I think that with each individual area that if you have interest in, those links that Anne provided, you can actually drill down on that and look for it yourself. But in relation to the trial that's going on at the Austin, it's not a curative trial. It's more just seeing how stimulation can be sort of like, or at the skin level, or it can be implanted. And so there's research going on all over the world in both those areas. The implantable ones are more promising. So that there's Neuralink and all those ones that they're trying to even implant in the brain. So, but they all come with a massive amount of risk. And this is the thing where people need to be really like people, as in we in wheelchairs, need to be caught up with the risks. And the thing is, because everyone just has an idea that the risk of surgery is the complication of research, is the complication of the trial. There's also other risks, like once you're in a trial, you can't be in another trial. So you don't want to get into a trial that precludes you from getting into a really good trial further down. So information is the key. And hopefully, those links that Anne provided are going to put us in touch with, better resources. And at the Research Institute as well, that's the main job. What Anne's doing is trying to educate people like us about research and how we can use it.
Especially, I reckon from those secondary issues, like, different ones, whether it's around spasm management, if there's something that's, a bit more natural to manage it, or even sleeping, because I know for myself, sleeping isn't great. And I think it was that one done by Antonio Vecchio, was about sleep apnea and in particular for quadriplegics. I'm not sure if it's applicable for paraplegics.
I can tell you results of that, but
would you mind?
Once you're done. Sorry, I was just looking up Project Spark. So there's been a lot of studies done by the Austin. So Mario knows some of the researchers as well. But so we look at fatigue as being an issue with people with spinal cord injuries. And they're like, okay, well, what is it about spinal cord injuries that cause fatigue? So they looked at, well, what are the elements that cause fatigue? They looked at sleep quality. Something that they found was that 80% of people with a C-level lesion spinal cord injury actually suffer sleep apnea. So then they know sleep apnea causes fatigue. So, and there are people that, and regardless of age, so it's not necessarily an older thing, or weight, because one of the things that they look at, Mario will know better than me, one of the things they look at for sleep apnea is, they'll tell you, lose some weight or have you put on some weight. That wasn't necessarily a factor. It was purely having a C lesion spinal cord injury. So then they did trials, they did the intervention, because the interventions exist. So they put CPAP machines on people's spinal cord injuries and their energy levels went up. So look, there are sometimes just a bit of, that goes back to that exploratory research. They asked the question, why are people with spinal cord injuries tired? Well, they're getting sleep apnea, or we have a treatment for sleep apnea. So then people's energy levels have gone through. That's fairly correct, isn't it, Mario?
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that this is where it touches on this important point that it's really important what the work that Anne's doing in involving people in chairs in directing research, because we have different expectations of what we want done from researchers, and people outside our community think that the main thing we're interested in is a cure. There are some of us interested in a cure, but most of us want improvements in daily life, so with pressure care, with sleep, research in those areas are the ones that will make a considerable difference to us. And that's why we need to be involved in the research direction and development.
All right. So Project Spark, Mario, NAS, isn't a study. So what they're pushing for, so it's not a study. What they're pushing for is Spinal Cord Injuries Australia, which is a Sydney-based organisation, are pushing for a federal government grant of up to $46 million into neurostimulation research. So they're not pushing for a type of research, they're pushing for a lot of research into neurostimulation. So that's what Project Spark is. Naz.
So, Antonio, my understanding of it, that they were actually doing trials in, I think, Sydney and in Melbourne, but I could be wrong.
Yeah. So now I know what you're talking about, because the SRI are associate investigators on some of that. So there are trials going on, or there will be trials going on because funding just got approved for looking at so respiratory neurostimulation in respiratory function. So that'll be done at the Austin and Melbourne University, but also in Sydney for gait, the benefits of neurostimulation on walking and gait function. So that Project Spark is an umbrella of all of that, essentially, that they're pushing for neurostimulation into different areas, and then different trials will come out of that. So that's my understanding.
Questions from online, from Nazim?
Antonio,
Yes,
I've got a question. It's a bit of a Dorothy Dixon, but I'm wondering what you think the best, the most promising research is at the moment.
it's an interesting question. So, all right, let me say this, because depending on who you ask, people will have biases. So if you ask a neuro researcher, they will tell you all these neuro research things on what they see. If you ask a basic scientist, they'll tell you about the work they're doing with rats. You're asking somebody with a background in trauma and psychological science, yeah? So, as well as social science. So, and I can make the argument that that type of research is the most important, and here's how. So some of you may be NDIS recipients, for example. So advocacy groups for years pushed for NDIS equivalent. It wasn't until research into the social benefit of having the NDIS and the economic benefit of having the NDIS came into place. So you're asking me, the biggest area where we can improve research is in social and psychological areas. Not to say that curative areas aren't important. So a lot of work needs to be done into the living with spinal cord injury, coinciding with medical research. So it's not one area, but once again, if you ask Mario being a doctor, and we know what, we can go around and ask everyone in this room what they think is the most important parts of research. Depending on our own perspective of living with spinal cord injury, we'll all give different answers. Some may say we need to invest in spasticity. A big area at the moment, I was talking before about it, is long-term studies around people living longer with spinal cord injuries. There aren't people that have lived, the life expectancy, like I said, was 2 years. If you're 20 years old now in America, the life expectancy is about 40 years if you acquire a spinal injury in your 20s. So part of what they don't know is how do people living with spinal injury for 20, 30, 40 years actually deal with secondary complications. So, yeah, I'm not dodging your question. I'm just saying it's a complex answer.
Okay.
You let Anthony have a say again. He's just.
Oh, yeah, I'll unmute you, Anthony. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm
Yep.
back, Antonio. I just had myself on mute. So is there an overall research field that is showing the best results for cures?
For cures,
Yeah, for cures.
so once again, the two areas that they're most hopeful of are stem cell, so regeneration, as well as, I guess, the neuro, both under skin and above skin.
What was that last one?
The stimulation devices, Anthony. Yep. So those two areas. Now, what part of the research going into them is they've got the theories, but they're finding out a lot of what those interventions can't do. So they're going, oh, we think it can do this, it might or cannot. To answer your question on that, in 20 years from now, they may have found something that we're not speaking about now by research into those areas. They may have found that stem cell may lead to something else. electrical stimulation may lead to something else. At the moment, they're the two focus areas that they're looking at for curative medicine.
So say the two areas again.
Yeah.
So say the two areas again.
Stem cells and neurostimulation.
All right. All right. That's good to know.
Anyone else before Josh winds up the presentation?
Georgina's on
Georgina,
your
yep, sorry.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. So with the research that you're talking about, is it being conducted in Australia? And
Yep.
if yes, are there similar ones or maybe identical ones around the world? And are we duplicating research?
Yeah, so part of what the SRI was started to do before I sort of joined was to focus on this idea of collaboration. So to answer your question, yes, there are studies in those areas that are happening in Australia, but they're part of what they call multi-center global studies, let's say. So they're getting participants. So part of it is you may get limited funding in Australia. Like, you know, there's only so much funding that can go around. But if they can show, look, we're going to get participants in Australia, the UK, Europe, Asia, let's say, they can get more funding and they get more participants. So like I was saying before, one of the issues is the limited amount of participants. So to answer your question, yes, those studies are happening in Australia, but what you'll find is they're part of global collaborations working together. And researchers really, well, we try and promote researchers sharing their findings with each other to benefit each other and then generate more studies.
And just to add to that, with the participant levels, are you finding that participants are willing to be part of the trials, or are there a lot of people hesitant to, you know, be guinea pigs and worry about their health?
It's hit and miss. So what we find is we think, but we don't know, and it's actually going to be part of what I do in my role, is people that are invested in spinal research are like, any trial that comes up that I'm eligible for, I'm going to do. Think about it yourself. Have you come across a trial and think of the reasons why you haven't got involved? Are you too busy? Is it not suiting you? Is the outcome not what you want? So there are different things. So once again, I don't necessarily get a lot of pain. So a trial that comes to me asking for participants that get pain, I'm going to ignore. But, you know, bladder issues or what have you, yeah. So to answer your question, I think it comes down to what the trial is. I think if there's a benefit to people that they are willing, I'll ask a question to everyone here. How many trials have you been a part of? What was it about the trial that made you participate? And what was it about the trial that made you not participate? You know, because as people with spinal cord injuries, we get exposed to trials. It's part of the deal. Or is part of the problem we don't know where to find trials. So, so there's a lot of unknown in that area, which is what I'm trying to work with in the program that we're looking to develop at the SRI. So,
and also, Georgina, I think you were sort of asking a bit about the duplication of research in different centers. It's actually a good thing. It's a really good thing, because oftentimes, like what I did early on, research in one area isn't duplicated in another area.
I'm wondering what trials are happening in Melbourne at the moment.
Yep. So those websites, australianclinicaltrials.gov.au, and like I said, I'll send the links to Josh. If you put in Melbourne on there, you put in your level of injury, and they'll tell you what's happening in Melbourne as we speak.
And what website's that?
I'll send them to Josh, and Josh will send them out to everyone. Okay. So there's three different websites out there.
All right, no worries. Beautiful.
No more questions, people? You go over Solidell, Antonio has that.
All right. There's no more questions. I will end the recording, and you can ask me all the questions that you don't want on the recording. So.
You need a toilet
Thanks
break.
very much, Antonio. That was great.